chapter, The Monroe Doctrine and American National Security in the 21st Century. I am Lilla Norakish, and I'm a Senior Fellow for International Affairs and Academic Integrity at the National Associations of Scholars. I'm delighted to be your host today. On behalf of the NAS, I would like to thank you all for spending your Friday afternoon with us. At its core, the Monroe Doctrine is a statement about how the United States understands security, sovereignty, and responsibility in its surrounding region. Since 1823, it has shaped how American leaders think about external threats in the Western Hemisphere, the role of outside powers, and the relationship between influence, power, and security. Over time, this doctrine has been interpreted in different ways by different administrations, and its meaning has also shifted in the international environment as it is changed. Now, 2 centuries later, the key question is how this way of thinking operates in today's world, defined by great power competition, ongoing challenges to territorial sovereignty, and persistent tensions between law, security, power, and legitimacy. The issues show up in real policy debates, in decisions about intervention and restraint, in debates over hemispheric security, and places where history, geopolitics intersect, such as Venezuela, Cuba, Greenland, and many more. This panel is meant to help clarify whether the Monroe Doctrine continues to influence American foreign policy and how it is understood by others in the 21st century. Today, the discussion will take place in 2 parts. First, we will hear individual remarks by our esteemed speakers, and after that, we will move into a discussion, followed by questions from the audience. I would like to encourage our audience to submit their questions through the Q&A. Okay, now let me introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Jay Sexton is a Rich and Nancy Kinder Chair in Constitutional Democracy and Professor of History at the University of Missouri, where he also directs the Kinder Institute. He is the author of the Monroe Doctrine, Empire and Nation in 19th Century America, and numerous works on U.S. foreign relations. Dr. John Grant is an associate professor and chair of Department of Politics at Hillsdale College. He is the author of Theodore Roosevelt, Imperial Uplift, and the Transformation of American Foreign Policy. Third, Dr. J. Michael Waller. Dr. Waller is a journalist and investigative writer on national security and political warfare and serves on the editorial board of the NATO Defense Strategy Communications Journal. In addition to his academic and policy work, he brings direct scholar practitioner experience from Latin America, including participation with the Nicaraguan resistance and counterinsurgency campaigns in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Colombia. With that, let's begin our discussion. Jay, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you for having me. And I'm glad to see so many people are interested in the Monroe Doctrine again. I've joked often in recent weeks that there's like national PTSD from the AP history exams as everyone's like scrambling to remember and to recall what the doctrine is. So that's what I kind of want to do in my 10 minutes here. I want to do, I guess, 3 or 4 things. I want to reintroduce the Monroe Doctrine and emphasize its original incarnation in 1823 as a limited reactive statement. Then I'm going to talk about how it became an invented tradition, how it became what we think of as the capital M, capital D Monroe Doctrine. And then we'll talk quickly about how it curiously disappears after 1945, at least from American diplomacy, only to now then reappear in the last couple of years. All right, so I'm on the clock, so let's get going. The first point, the original. What do you need to know about the original 1823 message? Well, you first need to know what the geopolitical trigger was, what prompted Monroe to assert the things that he asserted. And that was that the revolutions in Spanish America had reached their climax, and that sovereign independent republics were in the making. Spain's empire had collapsed. And the fear in 1823 was that the monarchical powers of continental Europe wanted none of that. They didn't want republicanism to spread in the New World because it might threaten their position in the Old. So there were fears that the French in particular, but some consortium of European monarchies would attempt to reconquer Latin America. Monroe and his team thought that this would be a danger to U.S. security. How was it to be a danger to U.S. security? Well, they spelled it out in a number of ways, but all linked back to the fact that the United States was a pretty weak republic at this time in 1823. And the fear was that if you had powerful, ideologically opposed neighbors, if you had monarchies in the New World, that this would exacerbate the internal divisions in the United States. Big debates like about taxation, for example. You'd need a standing army. They didn't want to have to deal with that. And then, of course, the biggest of them all, which maybe we can talk about in Q&A, is the question of slavery. Don't forget that the Missouri crisis was just 2 years before Monroe's message. So that's the context. The two other things you need to know about the original Monroe Doctrine, first is that it's limited, it's conservative, it's not really saying much, it's negatively framed. It's only saying, Monroe's only telling Congress, the message to the US Congress, what the European powers are not allowed to do. They're not allowed to intervene in the New World and to spread their political system. That's it. Doesn't say anything about what the United States will do to prevent that contingency from unfolding. In fact, Monroe and his team, they ask themselves that question. They're like, what if Europe ignores this message? And they're like, what a great question. We'll deal with that later. They never answer it, okay? So it's negatively framed. What Europe can't do leaves open the question, the matter of what the United States will do. And I think that's one of the reasons why this becomes a useful symbol later on. The other thing you need to know, of course, last thing about 1823 is, U.S. is a pretty weak power, at least in Atlantic terms in this period. It's the British that enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It's the British Royal Navy that prevents a reconquest attempt. And in fact, Britain and France had kind of signed a secret deal where the French said, we won't intervene in the New World. And that was even before Monroe issued his message, though the team didn't know that at the time. All right, so that's the beginning. That's the first point. The next phase is kind of unexpected, but this is the phase of how this limited, reactive, kind of routine document becomes imagined to be a national dogma, a new national doctrine of foreign policy. How does this happen? And I think that the key context for understanding this is kind of political and cultural. It's the fact that in the 19th century, you have a wave of nationalist symbols and documents being created and imagined to capture each nation's individual spirit. And there's a particular fetish with official records, official documents somehow embody what these nations are supposed to be. And you can see this happening in a number of different ways in 19th century America. One of the most prominent would be, of course, the Constitution itself, and how it's not just a document that creates kind of frameworks of government, but somehow it has spiritual meaning. Also, the Declaration of Independence is imagined in that vein. And later on, it's the Monroe Doctrine itself. So I think that's the first point about why it becomes such a powerful dogma. The second is that this symbol is profoundly contested. I write in my book that there are as many Monroe doctrines in the 19th century as there are perspectives on U.S. foreign policy. So there's an isolationist Monroe Doctrine, quite a powerful isolationist reading. There's also an internationalist one. There's an imperialist one, and then there's an anti-colonial one. There is a pro-slavery reading of the Monroe Doctrine, and guess what? You got it. There's an anti-slavery version of the doctrine. So when Americans are invoking this, what they're doing is they're actually disagreeing. They're appropriating a symbol which purports to encompass national values, and they're attempting to claim a certain reading of those values. So at its heart of the Monroe Doctrine is domestic politics, conflict, and debate about what is the role of the United States in the world. Last thing to say here about the invention of the Monroe Doctrine is that though it's all over the map, I mean, if you were to plot its invocations across the 19th century, it's just scattered all over the bulletin board, but there is a sort of trend line. And the trend line is that the doctrine is becoming more and more associated with those who advocate assertive and indeed imperialist foreign policies. And in fact, the first US president to call it the Monroe Doctrine, he actually calls it Monroe's Doctrine, is James K. Polk. And he does so in the context of his territorial ambitions in the Pacific coast. This sort of reading of it, I think, has its climax with Teddy Roosevelt, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, which justifies America's interventions in the Caribbean and Central America in the early 20th century. Okay, last point, the curious disappearance of the Monroe Doctrine. If you're to plot the invocations and usages of the term over time, and you can do this through a tool called Google Ngrams, what you'll find is that it becomes more and more used as the 19th century unfolds, is used quite a lot in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and then just drops off the map after 1945. It's no longer being an active kind of symbol or doctrine of US foreign policy. Why? Well, two obvious reasons. The first is geopolitical. Though the doctrine, the original doctrine, has an array of meanings, at its heart is a sort of sphere of influence foreign policy. The idea that there's special obligations or opportunities for the United States within its sphere of influence. That idea is, of course, out the door after 1945, when the United States becomes a more global, internationalist-looking power. You know, it's a global struggle against communism. The sphere of influence kind of still exists, but interventions in Latin America after 1945 are justified in the same way that interventions in Iran or Asia or Europe are. This is like America's struggle against Soviet communism. So that idea of sphere of influence runs counter to US foreign policy, and actually is the idea that the Soviets want to appropriate in East Europe and in their own, what they see as their own spheres of influence. So it goes away for the geopolitical reasons, that epochal shift in US foreign policy, but it also goes away because of the Cold War consensus. The lifeblood of the doctrine had always been domestic political conflict and debate. It had been appropriated by Americans, particularly in election years. After 1945, of course, there is a general consensus on the nature and the aims and objectives of US foreign policy. There's no longer the need to fight over a symbol in order to have one view reign supreme. That had already happened, and that's what the Cold War consensus was. So in conclusion, to take the story up to the present day, of course, why has the doctrine reappeared? Well, it's reappeared for the same two reasons that it disappeared. First, because of American geopolitics. The United States is a declining power, at least in relative terms. It does now see a need to have a more proactive set of policies in its sphere of influence. And indeed, this administration, spheres of influence are back. Globalism is out. So we shouldn't be surprised that this symbol is being used. And then, of course, the domestic conflict and debate, the lifeblood of the doctrine. We live in deeply divided political, partisan, culture war times, and it shouldn't be surprising that the doctrine has reappeared in that moment, for that's what gave birth to it in the 19th century. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jay, for this overview and telling us the story about the framing and, of course, the different interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, I would like to ask John to deliver his remarks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to focus on how the Monroe Doctrine relates to fundamental concepts at different periods, just several different periods, not a granular, very 30,000-foot picture of general concepts underlying international law, the law of nations. And, you know, the Monroe Doctrine is kind of it's the original Monroe Doctrine. It's a policy, obviously, but it also declares itself to be a matter of principle. And so the document says, you know, that it's a principle that we're not going to allow for further European colonization in the Americas. This involves our rights and our interest. And I think this relates very much to this paradigm of international relations related to the Declaration of Independence and the law of nations of the time. Of the civilized nations of the world, at least, are separate and equal in their rights. This kind of awkward status of the Monroe Doctrine with, say, international law. You can see, I looked into this just recently, the two great legal commentaries that made in the wake of this by Kent and Story on the Constitution, and with lengthy discussions of the law of nations, don't mention the Monroe Doctrine, because of course it's not a matter of international law. No other nations have recognized this as binding on them. You see this connection to the fundamental concepts of what you could call the Westphalian world order in a couple examples from the original document. The de facto government is, we say, that's the de jure government. That's and of course this is something we no longer adhere to. And we also declare we won't interfere in the purely internal concerns or things which do not affect our freedom and rights of European powers in Europe. And the doctrine says there's only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparations for our defense. There's not as Jay alluded to, there's not an imperialist orientation to this, the original. And of course, the problem with European expansion in the Americas would be the political system is hostile to us, and we think that's not going to go well. But this view, in other words, it's not merely originally that part of it, at least, is not a matter of alterable policy, but a matter of principle. And this changes later. You might call it the progressive or globalist orientation, and meaning that the application, the understanding of the Monroe Doctrine as a matter of policy has to change. And always, though, there's an issue with the Monroe Doctrine is a combination of policy and a principle. What's the status of the U.S. in relation to other great powers? What's the conceptual framework in which those relationships take place? It's been said, and it's a nice formulation, the U.S. is both present and absent in European and later world affairs and international law. And if you think of the debate over joining the League of Nations, we refuse to do that, but we do the Dawes and Young plans. The open door is another example. How would the mentality of the Monroe Doctrine square with the open door in China? This problem is much more prominent in the later globalist or progressive understanding of the Monroe Doctrine. How do you put together the universal aspirations of this order? So instead of an order where there's a different set of standards, and this is problematic, of course, but it was what it was for civilized or European nations and who are involved in the whole world, but didn't apply those same standards to an order that has universal aspirations and principles. Again, the Lodge objection, Henry Cabot Lodge's objections to joining the League of Nations. Well, how do you square? Well, we just want a reservation in favor of the Monroe Doctrine. Lodge said. Well, how do you have the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations and things like that, which have universal goals like separate understanding? The later iterations of the doctrine differences. So the original Monroe Doctrine is made in a world of sovereign nation states, or at least a world of Western world of sovereign nations, or what you could call, has been called the Westphalian order. And one of the underlying premises in this is that nations have, it's not just a juridical principle, but nations have different, what George Washington called in his farewell address, primary interest. And so you're going to have differences in regimes and things like that. Another way of putting this, there was no world order before. There was involvement in world affairs and world politics. There wasn't one order for the entire world before roughly 1900. And then there's an attempt to do that, after that. In this later, what I'm calling globalist orientation, and you could use, different terms for that. And this is a very wide umbrella, I'm lumping and not splitting here. All nations have the same primary interest. And examples of this would be things like Wilsonian self-determination, the prohibition of aggression in the Kellogg-Briand Pact, understood later as a fundamental crime of international law, or for FDR, the four freedoms, which for the entire world. These are all primary interests that all nations agree in, and you should have one world order. Not necessarily in the meaning of that, black helicopters and things like that, but one geopolitical order for the entire world. There's a blurring of foreign and domestic necessarily in this new order. Economics much more intensely connected in the private to politics than it had been before. You see a jettisoning of the idea that the de facto regime is the de jure regime with doctrines like the right to intervene when there's crimes against humanity, sometimes called the right to protect. It's hard to square the U.S. having a preeminent role in the Americas with these universalist understandings. The Roosevelt corollary is an example of this. It's sort of half in and half out of that older world. On the one hand, there's very much a concern for the security of the United States. On the other hand, we reserve the right to intervene in the affairs of other countries in the Americas if they're not living up to civilizational standards. This is part of this idea of progressive uplift and the idea that the advanced nations of the world need to help the less advanced, uplift them into civilization to promote peace. And a great example of this is Teddy Roosevelt's speech, Expansion and Peace. Again, there's a lot of different moving parts here, and some episodes, like the Monroe Doctrine, I think wholly absent from the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it would have obviously had been applicable. But if you think of the way John F. Kennedy was approaching world politics as a whole, it didn't make sense for him to invoke that. Again, these globalist standards. Real briefly, a take on the contemporary situation. So Trump has inherited this globalist situation, and we're moving away from that, I think, as Jay mentioned, but we're still in it. And I don't know, it's not so easy just to, we'll just get out of that. We'll just stop doing that. And you have this conflation of the primary interest of different nations, the related blurring of domestic and foreign. That's a reality. This intense connection between in the economic sphere and the political sphere, I think stronger than in the old Westphalian order. And what the Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine does, it tries to move in the direction of the older Monroe Doctrine's concern with hemispheric rather than global defense. And I think in part this is driven by pragmatic concerns about the decline of America's relative power, as Jay mentioned. I think that's right. But I don't think it indicates a return to the farewell address or the founder's understanding, because I don't think that's exactly possible. Because you do have a situation where for probably, we could fight about the origins, but 100 to 125 years of this globalist orientation. And problems, just to mention the Venezuela situation, very controversial, right? Part of that could very much be within the original understanding of the Monroe Doctrine, but there's the foreign influence or purported foreign influence, I think, really there of the Chinese, the Russian, et cetera. You also have things like immigration and refugee problem related to Maduro's rule and those of the countries rulers he works with, and sometimes called the Puebla Group, the other leftist regimes in the region. but that those weren't concerns. Immigration wasn't a part of the original thought of what to do in the Monroe Doctrine or even the Roosevelt Corollary. And so I think some of the basic hallmarks of what's called the Trump Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, there is an emphasis, a return to an emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, although not solely. An open, unabashed concern and preference for American interests, including strategic position, but also things like resources, just openly discussed instead of putting everything in moral categories like democracy or things like that. Civilizational demands for democracy are de-emphasized, and there's a lot of ties to domestic issues such as immigration, drug trafficking. Trump longtime emphasis on the carnage he called the American carnage of engendered by this trafficking. And yeah, we're in a transition phase, I think, trying to move from a purely globalist conception, at least in principle, to a more realistic American interest centered in a way very obvious. But there's going to be some incoherence theoretically because of that. Thanks.
Thank you, John. There was a lot of food for thought here, for sure. It's interesting that you mentioned the question of alternative policies and principle in the light of the Monroe Doctrine, so as the need for one world order. And I guess the debate and disagreement is much more about which vision should prevail over the others. Anyways, now I would like to ask Michael to share his insights with us.
Thank you, Leila. The whole approach to the Monroe Doctrine, which we just saw had been pretty much forgotten or abandoned, was formally junked by Secretary of State John Kerry in 2013. And that same year, within a month, was when China's first Belt and Road Initiative deals were made. So where you have the Monroe Doctrine was junked, and it was a doctrine that didn't look at non-European empires anyway. You find now a renewed importance of the Monroe Doctrine today, but it has to be modernized. And this is so I'd like to focus on the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which the president enunciated in his December national security strategy of the United States. And he calls it that. He adds it on top of the Roosevelt corollary, and it doesn't have the idealism that other interpretations have. It's very, very America first, but it's not imperialist in its nature. In fact, it recognizes that different countries are going to have different political views and different policies, but that we're all going to have common interests at one point or another. And that the fundamental obligation for the United States is to work with, or sometimes against, those countries and forces in the region that harm us, whether it's illegal immigration, as we'd heard, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's any number of other things. That's the fundamental premise of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but it goes far beyond that, because what the Monroe Doctrine and even the mentality behind the different interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine didn't include before was, who owns the critical infrastructure in the hemisphere? Who owns the resources in the hemisphere? Who owns the seaports, the waterways, later on the Panama Canal, access points to them? Who owns all that, and how does that affect our own security? So what the Trump corollary does, it really expands the view of what our national interests are in the region from merely keeping foreign military powers out, is to keeping. It doesn't use the word Chinese anywhere in the strategy, in the Trump corollary part of the strategy, but it's clearly aimed at China's encroachment in the region by taking over these nodes of critical infrastructure and transportation and military and other subversive presences. But it also considers other threats, not just the old Russian one, which remains there, but also the jihadis, Iranian Hezbollah presence, so extra hemispheric terrorist presence. So it's a really important step in modernizing the concept of a Monroe Doctrine as the Americas being one part of the world and one part where all extra-hemispheric hostile powers will be kept out. But it looks at it much more it goes back to some originalism in the thinking that there can be no mercantilism by external colonial powers in the American hemisphere anymore. And it tackles, without using the word, it tackles Chinese mercantilism in the hemisphere through Belt and Road and these other initiatives that are catching these countries in debt traps, subverting their political independence through indebtedness and through other measures and so forth. And so the new corollary takes that head on, but it also takes head on it says it quite literally. It says the doctrine will cultivate and strengthen new partners in the hemisphere, but it will force out foreign companies, aimed at the Chinese mainly, foreign companies from the hemisphere. So it's not merely a state-to-state issue or even a state-based mercantilist system. It's also certain foreign companies. So it introduces a whole new trade aspect that we hadn't thought of before, or that hadn't been really any presidential policy before. So but it also gets back to the John Quincy Adams approach and the Monroe approach of using restraint. There, they had to use restraint because we didn't have any real leverage in the region. But Adams was able, through his whole diplomatic career, to find ways to use American leverage in a gentle way and in a restrained way to secure our objectives, even when we were by far the weaker party. What the Trump corollary seeks to do as well is to use a similar restraint that was really crafted by John Quincy Adams, but revived in modern thought by Angelo Cotabila's posthumous book about John Quincy Adams, about how to use American restraint in an assertive way in the hemisphere. So this is what the Trump corollary talks about: not going in well, yes, securing the right to intervene when we must, but not going in a big stick kind of way, or in a McKinley type of way, even though Trump very much admires President McKinley, but in a very restrained way, with simple phone calls, with individual relations between presidents. You see how he's done this with the president of Mexico, who hates his guts, with the use of tariffs, and then with the use of finally being an example that where you have the president of Colombia, of all the politicians in South America, saying, well, maybe Trump had a point with Maduro. Well, we see eye to eye on so many of these issues. So you can see this administration is reviving the Monroe Doctrine without the need to use traditional military force. And that's a crucial aspect of how the Trump corollary fits into not just Western Hemisphere security, but our global interest. Last point on this: using the Monroe Doctrine, as was done so deftly in Venezuela, to hit hard at Chinese imperial ambitions elsewhere. So we can get into it a bit later on, but the pulling out, removing China's heavily discounted, sanctioned oil from Venezuela. It's only 4% of China's imports, but huge interest groups within the Chinese Communist Party, including the coastal refineries, were dependent on that fuel and on the Iranian fuel, also sanctioned because of the international embargoes, which together was about 20% of China's imports. And then the United States' ability to influence Arab countries on their oil exports, which the Chinese still have to pay for in petrodollars, but there are moves from some countries, like the Saudis, starting to accept the Chinese yuan. What Trump is doing is he's strengthening the petrodollar and pushing back on China's ability to import oil on super favorable terms, which makes the Chinese Communist Party's options far more limited in its plan to invade Taiwan, among other things. So you can see how the Monroe Doctrine under the Trump corollary is by no means an isolationist or even a merely sphere of influence doctrine, but it's one to maintain United States supremacy around the world.
Thank you, Michael, for connecting the past and the present, and it was a very, very practical insight. Thank you very much for doing that. Listening to all of your remarks, it brought up so many strategic questions, and I see that some of the questions are also appeared in the chat box from our audience. And I would like to combine some of these questions to try to cover as much as you can with your answers. So, for example, how should we understand the original intent and limit of the Monroe Doctrine, and what assumptions did its authors make about the international order, and whether this is still applicable today or overlooked today? Jay, what does the history professor think?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that what does the original have to do with the current? And I'd say one thing is very clear, and that is the original says that America's national security and interests are deeply conditioned by what happens in the Western Hemisphere. And the Trump administration is making that same argument in the national security strategy paper that was released back in December, right before Christmas. So there is an important common denominator. One thing that I think both my co-panelists referred to in their comments, one thing that's missing that's really notable is that, Monroe and his team made a connection between national security and ideology, political ideology. They, decried or feared European intervention, not just because it was a kind of rival power structure being built up close to the United States, but because it was representative of a hostile political system of, obviously in that case, monarchy. And you kind of see that idea expanding over time, and the geographic limits of how American statesmen identify their ideological threats expanding until you get to the Cold War. And the Cold War thinking about Soviet communism being a threat to the United States does link ideology and interest in the same way. What I'm struck by is that there is none of that language and none of that thought really underlying the new Trump corollary. It is about flexible partnerships and deals, as we've heard, with different regimes. There's a clear shift actually in who the United States is allied with in Latin America, as we've heard from the days of John Kerry trying to curry favor at the Organization of American States to the Trump administration now. The question is that going to matter? Is ideology important to America's alliance systems and to the long-term pursuit of American interests? I happen to think that it is really important, and that this is one of the things that is quite concerning about the Trump corollary. But don't let a historian make a prediction about what's going to happen. But I can say with confidence that it is something different and new. One more thing, and I'll shut up here. I saw in the chat people were talking about limits and constraints. And we heard Mike made a very good point about, right when the Venezuela action unfolded last month, everyone was panicking, freaking out that this was like full-on intervention and imperial rule, when actually it was a very precise and targeted intervention at a leadership group, actually at a leader himself. And clearly the intent is to try to rule through proxy, to avoid boots on the ground, to limit the overhead costs of achieving U.S. objectives in the region. I would just remind everyone that that was the innovation that Teddy Roosevelt made in 1904. He had backpedaled from the 1898 McKinley policy of full-blown colonialism. He said, we're going to have a more targeted light footprint. We're only going to take over, in that case, the customs houses. Yeah, we'll take over the customs houses, and then we control the money, and then we can pay off the debt, and then voila, no problems, no foreign threats. So it was a similar innovation in its time, but of course, it led to those quagmires of the early 20th century. It was the first step in what was a protracted series of occupations that were incredibly unpopular in American politics, and then led, last point, to congressional oversight or limits being placed on future interventions in the Caribbean and Central America. So whoever asked about constraints, I would say U.S. Congress and the and public opinion have been really important historically, and I suspect they'll be important in the coming months and years.
Thank you so much, Jay. I believe that historians usually say that history tends to repeat itself, so it's probably a good prediction for the future, at least to discuss these issues. And you mentioned limits and constraints, and there were so many questions in the chat about that. So I think we can turn now to the political sciences and see how did the Monroe Doctrine and later corollaries reflect evolving ideas about sovereignty and intervention and legitimacy within the largely Westphalian international system. John, what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, the power... Then there's constraints just built into the reality of things. I mean, and this came up already. The original Monroe Doctrine, they couldn't have enforced it really if there'd been a determined effort by a European power to, I mean, kind of lucked out that the English had an interest in working in that area, and these powers didn't actually agree on a lot of things. But anyway, there's always that. Those constraints, as Jay mentioned, domestic political opinion is powerful. Congress, when it wants to be, I mean, it can be very, very powerful. And recent history, I think the presidential war powers, in many ways, grew during the Cold War. And although that's long over now, obviously we still, so Trump much more constrained domestically than he is internationally, but there are still real constraints. And of course, Congress could stop that. Ideals, especially when they're shared, can provide a constraint. And that's one of the big problems here is, are there real shared ideals in the international community? I think we've seen a breakdown in that and serious disagreements among people, even who are allies, as we're seeing with tensions over Greenland, which is a Monroe Doctrine issue, right? And NATO. And we don't have, that's probably the biggest underlying problem, I think, of all of this is a breakdown in the older shared consensus about what justice is among nations. It was never perfect, but and I think the problems revealed by the war on terror with that are come home to roost. And so I know a lot of people who are, Trump promised us no interventions, which of course he never said that, but they're so upset about the past 20 years, roughly speaking, that Venezuela looks like Iraq, although they're obviously radically different. So and I don't know how to fix that. And Trump's lack of idealism in this, I don't mean that as a criticism. I think his very pragmatic, realistic approach is partly based on being Trump and partly, well, what ideals would you appeal to?
Great questions. Thank you so much for your insights. I would like to bring in a question from the audience and just combine it with the conversation and ask you, Mike, about the potential cooperation with allies. Whether do you think it's important for the U.S. to cooperate with its allies and rely on ideas that were formed the international order, and whether the U.S. should focus more on working collectively with its partners and allies and international organizations, including using the economic, technological, and diplomatic strengths to lead through the cooperation rather than applying a regional dominance. This is one of the questions from the audience, and I thought that we could pick your brain about this one.
Well, there's first you have to define what is an ally. So we have our allies with which we have treaties for mutual assistance as military allies, and like say NATO or something. And then, but we also have a hemispheric treaty, the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, which is a multilateral treaty, not really like NATO, but it's still a treaty, a Cold War era treaty that still exists, and it has, it can be invoked at any time, but we can't apply it unilaterally. Sometimes we just have to go it alone, especially when some of our mutual assistance or reciprocal assistance allies are anything but allies at all. When they're a regime like Brazil or in the president of Colombia or elsewhere, they're certainly not our allies. But under the Trump corollary, we can still work with them. And this is what's very important, where the corollary is not seeking to impose a U.S. ideological imprint on other countries as long as those countries don't impinge on our core interests. At the same time, though, we are of no use to our European allies or traditional great allies or our Asian allies unless we're solid in our hemisphere. It was the Zimmerman telegram that was the ultimate provocation that got us to become involved militarily in World War I, meaning a direct threat to our southern border by Germany. So we can't be any good to any of our allies anywhere unless we're strong in our hemisphere.
Wow, it's such a complex issue. Now I would like to navigate us to the second part of the conversation and shift the focus more on actual policy issues. But we already have started it in the first part, so we just continue this. I would like to ask that in practical terms, how does what the Trump administration has called flexible realism guide policy decisions in the Western Hemisphere today? And when does restraint strengthen U.S. credibility, and when does it risk being seen as disengagement by allies and others there is? And partially you already answered some of this, Mike, but I would like to ask if you would like to add anything.
It's a big question because not even Trump's political allies know what he's going to do next. So is he going to go all the way on something that he says he will, or is he going to go halfway? Is he going to strike a deal? Nobody knows, which is difficult for everybody, including our best allies, but it's also difficult for our adversaries. And especially places like China, where they really require a lot of predictability and a lot of order and no shocks to the system and no room for uncertainty, because in a system like the Chinese Communist Party, people can't think or act innovatively without a lot of approval from the top. So yeah, this is a stage of no predictability. We don't even, if we have a Western Hemisphere Assistant Secretary of State, I don't know who it is. It's that new, but it's been a year and we still have had a vacancy almost that long, or even to this day, where in this one region of such great importance, you don't have an Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs because it's all run by the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State is seldom in the State Department. He's almost always in the White House. Now, luckily, the Western Hemisphere is one of the most important foreign policy issues to him, especially with his heritage. And you can see where it's going now, choking off the Cuban regime. So I think there is a degree of predictability when you look at Marco Rubio and what motivates him, and the huge confidence President Trump has in him and giving him all these positions that he's been given and all these different roles. And the thing is, there are very few people within the bureaucracy who can carry out that vision because they're just not tuned to it, either ideologically or bureaucratically.
Thank you, Michael. John, how much of U.S. hemispheric policy has rested on Westphalian order and assumptions about sovereignty, territorial control, and legitimate intervention? To put simply, do you think that that word still meaningfully exists today?
It might serve a useful purpose as a restraint on some of the worst type of excesses, but it's really hard to see how the older understanding of sovereignty, where nations are, free, meaning they're independent. They just make up their own within the bounds of what's possible, or they think is possible. They're free and equal. There's such a disparity in power, in economic output, in natural resource that I don't think Trump intends to dominate any of these countries in the sense of, take them over and manage them. But the economic aspect is another area of uncertainty, which came up earlier, that an open, foreign companies could be subject. We need to get them out in some cases where it's vital to us. Obviously, you're interfering in the internal concerns of these countries, and I think that's actually defensible in many cases, at least. But it's one of these concepts which is a bedrock of the current system and doesn't have a clear meaning. Seems to be it's invade unprovoked another country, but can you support domestic groups to overthrow the regime? There's a lot of things that would have thought to, and you can't do that because it's a sovereign country. That's fine. And so, what does sovereignty mean? It's kind of it's open. So it has some utility, but it's very limited by the lack of shared understanding of what that means and perhaps even the reality.
Thank you so much for mentioning the control of these countries. And actually, I can bring in a question from the audience. Someone asked whether President Trump used the Monroe Doctrine to invade and take over Venezuela, and how and whether this was an appropriate move. And I would like to ask you, Jay, could you tell us about this and the Monroe Doctrine's relevance in the light of this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, the tendency has been for I guess it's now 5 years of Trump administration foreign policy, the conventional wisdom was it was incoherent, it was case-by-case basis, it was trying to leverage power to squeeze maximum advantage in isolated instances. I think I garbled that, but you know what people tended to think. And then you think about this new national security strategy statement. You think about the symbolic coherence and the sort of historical resonance of the Monroe Doctrine. You think about the things that the administration has been banging on about: Venezuela, Cuba, Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada. It all kind of starts to make more sense that this seems to be that there is more of a coherent take. That's the first point. Second point is I still don't think we should go too far down that road, because I think that actually the Monroe Doctrine imposes a coherence and makes a story that might have some common denominators more coherent than it actually is. And I think that the doctrine itself, what's always been important about it is its domestic political symbolism. I think this is an administration that is incredibly adept, very shrewd, very savvy about exploiting nationalist symbols, national history for partisan gain. I mean, think this is the president that takes photo ops at Mount Rushmore. Yeah, this is the president that created the 1776 project in opposition to the 1619 project and so forth. So I think that there's a lot of that in this, that this is just kind of what the Trump team does, and they do it quite well. They leverage history to their advantage. Last point I want to say about this is the thing that's striking to me about this is, where are the Democrats? And I mean that in a dual sense. Where are they in the sense of, do they have a foreign policy vision? Like, what is the Democratic alternative to this still inchoate but emerging, coalescing Trump view of 21st century geopolitics? Spheres of influence being back, ideology and Democratic-based alliances being worthless, case-by-case leveraging of power, jacking up tariffs, building walls, ending immigration. I mean, it is like a worldview that's coming into being. It's symbolized by the doctrine itself. What's the alternative? And again, the history of the doctrine, what tends to happen is you get a strong figure like a Polk or a Teddy Roosevelt or a Trump invoking the doctrine on behalf of a new kind of brand of foreign policy. And then the opposition party reappropriates it. It says, no, This is what the Monroe Doctrine really is. This is the place of the United States in the world. I'm hearing none of that from the Democratic Party, and I think that's a bad thing. I think it would be incredibly healthy for the United States if its democratic politics seriously engaged with what is the single most important issue facing us today, which is how does the United States maintain its security and pursue its interests in a rapidly changing world, and in a world which is becoming rapidly more dangerous. And I think it's more dangerous, not exclusively because of Trump shredding norms and alliances and engaging in unilateral acts, but everyone around the globe is doing the same. We've heard about the Chinese threat. We know about the threat in the Middle East from Islamic organizations. Even Mark Carney's speech at Davos about middle powers and about Canada, that I find that also very destabilizing. It's the sort of Trump logic that middle powers on a case-by-case basis will build coalitions to pursue their own interests. All of this stuff is making the world less safe. Is there a debate about this at home? Absolutely not, and I wish that there was.
Wow, that was a lot, and I saw that John might wanted to jump in and say something, or did I miss your reaction?
Oh, no, I was struck by it. I was very interested and just struck by it. I don't have a response, and that it would be good if we would debate these things, and when the opposition party has nothing to say, it's very troubling. I agree. Yeah.
Actually, it was really interesting because there was a question in the chat referring to potential threats of retaliation as an answer to the Monroe Doctrine in today's context. And I actually wanted to ask all of you whether you think that it's a realistic scenario, whether it's a realistic threat that either these middle or smaller powers can retaliate, and how.
Leela, I'd like to get back onto that last question because Jay and John both brought up something, and you did in your comment, and that is all the Latin American studies departments in America are skewed in one certain direction. All of them. The entire foreign policy establishment, Democrat or Republican, has been proven wrong. They have allowed all of these troubles to fester, whether it's immigration or a 40-year forever war on drug trafficking, or allowing communist China to come in and actually have a strategy to turn the Caribbean into the East China Sea. Our entire foreign policy establishment, based on what they've been taught in the universities, has failed us on all of these. So for Trump to come in and do this disruptive act is just a wonderful thing. I'd like to see some scholarship just pour out of all of this.
Wow, that's also a very, very great insight, and I think it's also connecting to one of the other questions in the chat, asking about the limitations for the Trump corollary and if any exist, and the person who asks us about the geographic and economic and infrastructural limitations and brings up Panama Canal and Cuba after Venezuela, and rare earth extraction when it comes to economic issues. So I just wanted to ask if any of you would like to jump in and respond.
Well, I mean, just to underscore the importance of infrastructure, classically defined, and this has been associated with the Monroe Doctrine, it's most of its history at least, things like access to ports. The Panama Canal is, of course, really significant. They used to talk of coaling stations in the Caribbean. We might now talk about different usages of these sort of ports and facilities, but it is an important bit of like the hard bit of security and power. And I would just say that one thing, a common thread here in the United States' internal history in, let's say, the last 30 years, as well as its foreign policy, is an inability to build things inability to restore its infrastructure at home, coasting off what was built in the days of the Cold War, both at home and abroad. And now it's very clear we got to get serious about this stuff again. So I think that's an important element. I do want to go back, like, yeah, our Latin American studies and professors, leftists, of course they are. And I think that is a problem, not that they're leftists, but that they're only from really one end of the political spectrum. I would see some encouraging signs that that's beginning to change, but it's going to take forever to turn that tanker around because of the glacial pace in which both higher ed and foreign policy making, the bureaucracy of American government works. It's a slow, gradual game, but I think there's promising signs. That being said, I would not throw the whole post-1945 order under the bus, or even the post-1973 order, if we want to talk about it that way. This is an era in grand sort of macro scale of unprecedented prosperity for the United States. It was also an era in which there was international stability that matched that domestic stability. The number of deaths from warfare, for example, really tapered off at the late 19th and late 20th and early 21st century, and it's been creeping back up again, a sign of that instability. I think you kind of make a similar argument about market volatility in financial markets and so forth. So the world's getting much more dangerous. The question is Trump's vision going to advance U.S. security interests? Is it going to make the United States more stable? I don't see the evidence for that yet, especially in a domestic political sense. It seems to me that the trend line is more instability, more conflict, more rancor, and then more weakness of the United States on the international stage. But again, we're getting into the present, and I can't predict that. And if Mike's right, I'll be delighted that the United States is going to enter another golden era. But high tariffs, immigration restrictions, sphere of influence, geopolitical rivalries. I mean, that's what's happening today. That's a description of the world in, say, the first half of the 20th century, the world that gave us the Great War and the Second World War. So I don't necessarily think that the historical track record of this kind of vision of U.S. in the world affairs is one that gives me much optimism.
That's amazing. Thank you, Jay. I would like to ask whether history or political science or practice has an answer to the the threat of potential retaliation, whether it's a valid threat, and whether it happened before, and how should the U.S. react if that's the case.
You're referring to your previous question about small countries retaliating? Sure, they have an amazing capabilities at their fingers. Just look at the power Cuba has had. A country that it never, since Castro took over, has it been independent. It's always been taking money from some greater power. Its only real good exports are used to be rum, cigars, and subversion. And so the Cuban regime's training of terrorists and subversives worldwide is second to none. The Cuban intelligence service was even better than the KGB in terms of its own ability to counter the CIA, to turn CIA officers. The CIA never had a penetration of the Cuban government that the Cuban government did not turn. The only peer to the Cubans was the East German Stasi. Not even the KGB could boast of that record. So we tend to underestimate what small powers like Cuba could do, which is why it'd be a great opportunity right now for Trump to bounty or buy the entire Cuban intelligence service, all the people in it, all of the archives and files and operational records in there, and basically take the whole thing over as that regime collapses. So, but they're still in a position to do us a great deal of harm, as are outside actors, because of the vulnerabilities we have, the uncontrolled immigration that we have had here where we don't know who's here, who has sent in hit teams, assassin teams, sabotage teams. We just don't know.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your insights. We also have more questions, and I would like to try to respond to them. One of the listeners is asking about economic cooperations and potential partnerships through economic cooperation, and he or she brings in the example of India, and mentioning that India is extending and strengthening its alliances through economic cooperation and partnerships, and whether this approach provide a useful lesson for the United States to strengthen its alliance and the stability in the Western Hemisphere.
I think Trump is trying that. Mike might know more about this, or Jay for that matter, but his comments about the Venezuelan oil industry, I don't think he meant we're going to send in the Marines and dominate it. I think he meant we're going to help that work and partner, cooperate, and bring greater prosperity to Venezuela too. So I think he is trying that, and I think that would be very useful and important. I mean, for the wealth, but also for the goodwill. And I think that definitely is I think happening or attempting to happen, and would be great.
I mean, the thing to watch here, I know the question's asking about India, and we're talking about Latin America, but if you think about just the sort of scale, the transatlantic economic relationship and connection has been so significant to the United States since 1945. And there's something of a paradox, until maybe very, very recently, but even in Trump 1 and in the Obama era, in retrospect, you can say that the transatlantic tie, the political tie, was weakening. The bond was weakening. The public legitimacy on both sides of the Atlantic for institutions like NATO was eroding. People just didn't care, or they didn't think it was legitimate. They thought it was an unfair use, an unjust use of their tax dollars to build some supra-Atlantic institutional connection. So the political connection, withering, volatile, uncertain, but the trend line of the economic connection, if you look at exchange of goods and services, if you look at capital, if you look at financial services at the sort of high end of the economy, the trend line there was unmistakable, that the bond was strengthening. It was increasing. There was more and more Atlantic exchange of an economic, material, and financial nature. So there was a disjoint, what I'm trying to say, between the economic story and the political story. What seems to be the case in its early days, but what seems to be the case in the last year, because of the tariffs, because of the Greenland issue in particular, is that political volatility is now showing up in changing economic relations and connection. Now, some might think that that's a good thing, and it might well be. There certainly does need to be a more coherent national industrial policy, both within Europe, so it can defend itself against Russia, but in the United States, as we have a crumbling infrastructure and we don't make as much as we used to make in terms of actual things. So maybe it's to be welcomed that there's new tariff walls. But when we have that, we're going to lose the benefits of that old economic exchange. So I would just posit the guess that, to see how this idea is going to play out, hone in on the transatlantic economic connection, see if the political volatility matters or if it has a negative effect, and then see what the response of these different nations is going to be.
Thank you for bringing up the elephant in the room, Greenland. I actually wanted to ask you about this, because probably many people in our audience don't know that Greenland used to be part of the European Economic Community through Denmark. When Denmark acceded the European Union in 1973, Greenland, as a former colony and that time county of Greenland, Denmark, joined the EU, or the predecessor of the European Union, with it. And during the 70s, Greenland gained independence from Denmark and became the co-state of Denmark. And one of their first decisions as a co-state of Denmark was to exit the European Economic Communities, and they exited it by 85. So it was a very short story to be in the European Economic Community, but they remained in the broader European economic intersphere by partially because they are still a co-state, independent co-state of Denmark, and another reason is because they become a so-called overseas country and territory to the European Union. So in this regard, they are receiving funding from the European member states and support to build infrastructure, and there are a lot of ongoing projects for rare earth minerals and other infrastructural developments. So in this regard, we can see that Greenland is becoming very strategic, not just because of the European third polism, but also because it has a history with the European integration. So in Europe, it is increasingly discussed as in terms of strategic autonomy and of course, as I mentioned, Europe's role in the world, in the third pole. And my question to the panel: how should the United States think about Greenland in a way that accounts for sovereignty, alliance politics with its largest partner, the European Union, and of course partnering in the NATO alliance, and whether this can be solved in a less harmful way, as recent communication shows?
Greenland is of increasing importance, and we couldn't really have won World War II as quickly as we did in Europe without Greenland. And when Greenland is part of a European kingdom that won't defend that territory on which our commerce and our naval freedom of the seas depends, then that's a problem. Now, the Danes have been great about letting us do whatever we need to do to defend Greenland and to use Greenland in our own national defense. But think of what's going on in the world right now, where Greenland suddenly becomes of much greater importance. The dog sled metaphor actually is true, where Denmark's increased defense budget was to have 2 more dog sled teams in Denmark. They don't have a single ship or even a helicopter home ported or home based in all of Greenland. So the Danes are not defending, and they really can't defend Greenland. Now, if we do so, we need to make sure that we're never going to have that right to self-defense taken from us. So if and when Greenland becomes independent, we need to have an influence in how that is done. And it would be to our great advantage to have it become a protectorate of the US. So if you look at Greenland, not from the Mercator projection maps that we're all accustomed to, but from straight down over the North Pole, it's like a giant Panama Canal. So you cannot get from the Pacific to the Atlantic without traversing either the Panama Canal, the Cape of Good Hope, or the shortest and fastest route is over the Arctic, through the Bering Straits, and then through either the Northwest Passage of Canada, where you have to go past Greenland, or through the Greenland, Iceland, UK Strait, which goes past Greenland's other coast. So somebody has to be in control of that. Then if you look at how the Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles are aimed at us, and its Arctic-based submarine launch ballistic missiles are aimed at us, most of them have to pass over Greenland to strike us, meaning we have to have a missile defense system based in Greenland to knock these things down in the atmosphere, before they're in their trajectory to hit us. And with the Russian hypersonic missiles now, just 11 minutes of flight, they're over Greenland. There's no way we can protect ourselves without having dominance of Greenland. And that's to say nothing also of China's huge naval presence, and China building itself up as an Arctic naval force, when it also has a strategy to become an Atlantic naval force. Greenland is of supreme importance, and this is where the Monroe Doctrine automatically includes Greenland by default.
If I could just jump in on this, and I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's a very strategically significant, and especially in the coming decades, because of the melting of the polar ice caps, it's going to be more and more important to defense, security, and then also to rare earth minerals and mining. Okay, now look what happened though in this episode. The administration shredded alliance systems going back to the 1940s in order to get what in essence we already had in the United States, and that was privileged access, both of an economic and a security nature. We could have gotten what we got without the big uproar that the attempt to claim or say we were going to buy or to conquer, to take over, not taking military force off the table with our allies. This is when the actual style of the Monroe Doctrine and of the administration matters. It matters, and it might, okay, you could say maybe this helped us get a little bit sweeter of a deal than we already had. Okay, fine, but at what cost? And the United States' true power, I've always thought this, I've always said this, it's not like how many missiles do we have, how many mining companies are up in Greenland, how many bars of gold do we have in Fort Knox. That's not been our true power. The true power has been that the United States as an idea, as a model of democracy, has found traction across the globe. People have wanted to ally with us rather than in the Cold War with the Russians or in World War II with the Germans and the Japanese. That's been the true source of our power. And I'm afraid that we're losing sight of that in pursuit of narrow interests on a case-by-case basis. And the true price for this, I don't think, will be apparent until further down the stream. And each time we do a Greenland-type episode, we're going to squeeze out less and less and less because we've already deflated and constricted and eroded our credibility. So I both agree with Mike about the significance of Greenland, and it's going to be even more significant in the coming years, but I'm just at a loss for why the administration pursued those interests in the particular way that it did. It's such a high cost for such little gain.
No, yeah, I wasn't talking about style in this case. It was just about strategy. My Danish friends who are in a position to say that we could have gotten all we wanted from Greenland over a period of time if we were just more discreet about it.
And let it be said as well that the Danish servicemen that fought alongside the United States in the post 9/11 wars and are being dishonored by the administration, that's the sort of thing that actually really, really matters, that people around the world remember that kind of a thing. And the credibility of the United States is at stake. And some of the people that talked a lot about credibility in the days of the Cold War are forgetting about its significance now when its issue is, I think, appearing in a slightly different context or with a different political calculus. So important to note the Danes' contribution, all of the NATO allies' contribution to the United States after 9/11.
It's maybe timely to ask what is the future of the transatlantic relationship in the light of Greenland and all of this political signaling about the relevance of Europe, NATO, and of course, all the questions about taking over Greenland in a way or another. How should this be interpreted by the partners of the United States? I don't know if anyone has an answer to that.
Yeah, first, everyone understands this is a transitional time in an American presidency. You have a president who has only 3 years left in his term, and that even this president, anyone can cut a deal with them. It just matters what kind of deal. So Europe needs us greatly. They're going to get over this. They're not used to being treated this abruptly or rudely or whatever, but you can even tell it's not so much the message that's the problem that it is the messenger. Because if you look at most NATO countries since Trump's first term, have done pretty much what he said he wanted them to do about raising their defense budgets to a certain percentage of their GDP, becoming more responsible for their own defense, depending on us a lot less. They're yelling and screaming right now about it, but they have been doing this since about 2018 or so. So we'll still have a transatlantic relationship. It'll be a different one, but it can't help but continue because Europe has Russia to deal with, and so it needs us. We need Europe for various reasons too. But also, to get back to something Jay said about the Danes, it was the Danish intelligence services that have produced the best report so far that I've ever seen about Chinese threats to Greenland and the greater Arctic region. So you still have allies in there that we really, really depend on. And they have Denmark with its huge merchant fleet, with Maersk especially, has so much to offer us in ways that we don't really talk about globally, that Denmark remains a vital ally to us.
You know, I think it's important when you think about the future of the transatlantic connection, the relationship, to realize that it's more than, and always has been more than, you know, intelligence sharing, joint naval operations, State Department officials, Boeing executives, retired colonels, and so forth. I mean, that's part of it. That's a super important part of it. But what's made the transatlantic connection so powerful since 1945 until recently was the popular legitimacy that it had, the purchase it had among voters on both sides of the Atlantic. Bear with me for 30 seconds as I tell you my favorite story. My favorite story just down the road here, 16 miles from where I sit, is a town called Fulton, Missouri. Now, Fulton, Missouri is a small college, is Westminster College. Winston Churchill came here to the middle of nowhere in 1946, and he gave that famous Iron Curtain speech in which he kind of laid out the vision of what the Cold War was about. More important than what Churchill said was what happened in the town itself. The town's leaders decided, they took it upon themselves, how could they make the town, put it on the transatlantic map? They raised funds and they moved stone by stone a Christopher Wren church from a bombed out area in East London that the Germans had bombed out during the war, moved it over here to honor Churchill and built, reconstructed this 17th century English church here. And who paid for it? Like normal people, farmers. It wasn't like some big project by some wealthy donors. Farmers, people in the community, because they felt invested in the transatlantic connection. They think that the United States was part of a wider struggle. We were kindred with our allies across the Atlantic. I'm afraid that has just been completely shredded. And I can't blame Donald Trump for that. I think he's a symptom of that rather than a cause of that. People in places like Fulton, Missouri, do not think that the international order benefited them and was legitimate. Now, I take issue with that. I think that they don't see some of the ways in which it was. But in order to restore the transatlantic connection, it's a political and sociological project just as much as it is a geopolitical or military one. And here again, last point, where's the American left? Where are the Democrats? Where's the Democratic Party offering an alternative vision of how the United States might fit in with the world and might find alliance partners outside of its own borders? I think that would be really healthy and also a political opportunity for those who might see it.
Thank you, Jay, and also for pointing out the mutual dependence or interdependence of the US and Europe. I think it's a very important message to our audience, and of course, maybe in the broader audience as well. I see that we are getting close to the end of our panel, so I would like to move to the third part where I am delivering some concluding reflections, and of course, I will ask all of you to give takeaway messages to our audience. So I would like to thank you for your participation and your very interesting thought. What today's conversation has shown us is that the Monroe Doctrine is not simply a historical artifact, but a way of thinking that continues to shape the US foreign policy and action. We have heard how its meaning has evolved over time and how it interacts with the changing assumptions about power, legitimacy, security, and how it raises difficult questions in today's environment of great power competition. We've also seen that these debates are not only American debates, but much broader than those. And they are also closely watched by international partners, allies, competitors, and many more. Rather than offering a final answer, I hope that today's panel was a good help for our audience to clarify the stakes and sharpen the questions that policymakers, practitioners, scholars continue to face. Before we close, I would like to ask each of our speakers to share one takeaway message. Can we start with you, John?
Sure. In the spirit of your concluding remarks, I think that we're in a time of transition and great challenges, and there's a tendency to, in our politics to thoughtlessly cast aside things that it's dangerous to cast aside, and thoughtlessly to cling to things that maybe we shouldn't cling to in the same way. And I think serious and sustained reflection on what the Monroe Doctrine is a great example. There are other things that can help us to avoid those extremes and not to not to do damage when we don't have to have damage. A lot of tragedy in politics, but a lot of it's not necessary.
Thank you. Jay?
Yeah, no, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks to the co-panelists and the moderator. This was fantastic. I guess my parting message is one of hope and optimism that these big questions of geopolitics and foreign policy and national security and threats. The hope is that the democratic processes and structures within the United States can still deliver the good, that the American people can, through elections, through engagement with elected officials, through engagement at the local level, can begin to find their way through these newly difficult and troubled times. And we cannot rely on presidents and secretaries of state to do this for us, because every 4 years it'll be someone that one of us doesn't like, and then it'll be someone that one doesn't. It has to have a democratic foundation. And I think that's the story of the post-1945 order for the United States. I still think there's more miles in the the tires of American democracy. And I look forward to seeing how its democratic system adapts to these new international orders and how the United States rises to the occasion once again, as it has done in the past.
Thank you, Jay. Michael?
Well, the whole controversy of what President Trump has done with the Monroe Doctrine has been a really exciting moment for everybody, regardless, I think, of what they feel, because it's going to force everybody to rethink everything about the Monroe Doctrine, what it means, what its relevance is to us, and then build some kind of a framework through which we can reassert our own basic interests in the hemisphere. So it's a really exciting time, even though it's driving everybody up the wall because we don't know what's coming next.
Thank you for your takeaways. On this note, I would like to thank our speakers again for their expertise and our audience for their interest. If you are not already a member, we warmly invite you to consider joining the National Association of Scholars. And of course, please stay tuned for future NAS events and discussions. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.